Okay, thank you and welcome everyone. We already have a number of people that have joined, and so we will get started now. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Closing the Gap in Health, the Rise and Challenges of Femtech. This is a webinar that's being brought to you by Brazilian Association Women in IP. I'm Tatiana Machado, and I'll be hosting this event with Anna Calil. We are both co-founders and directors of Women in IP. And today we are also joined by three amazing professionals who will share with us some of their knowledge and experience with Femtechs. We have here with us Kathrin Folkendt. She's a founder and CEO of Femtech Insider, which is the globally leading platform for women's health innovation. And by the way, if any of you have looked into their LinkedIn, aren't following them, I strongly recommend that you do so because it's a great source of news about Femtech. Kathrin, she started her career in the tech industry, then went on to work with numerous startups and scale-ups across Europe, Asia, and the US. And since being diagnosed with polycystic ovary syndrome and experienced firsthand the problems of women's health space, Kathrin has dedicated her time and efforts to innovating in the healthcare industry, working with stakeholders across the women's health innovation ecosystem. And she's a frequent speaker on those topics too, and she will provide us with a very important view of the business side of this industry. Next, we have Luíza Mueller, who is a shareholder at Casimir Jones and splits her time between the Chicago and North Carolina offices. For over 30 years, Luíza has provided strategic counsel on complex patent issues to clients in the plant, food, pharmaceutical, biopharmaceutical, biotechnology, and chemistry sectors. And last but definitely not least, we have Fran Salisbury, who is a European and UK patent attorney and partner at Mewburn Ellis LLP, based in the UK. She's Mewburn's women's champion, responsible for running the Women of Mewburn Ellis network, which provides space for women and allies to support and champion each other, regardless of their role within the company. Fran is passionate about supporting women in IP, much like all of us, both for those working as IP advisors and attorneys, but also for women looking to use IP as a tool to help build their business. Her patent work spans the life science sector, but is particularly focused on precision medicine and advanced therapeutics, working with startups and large multinational life science companies. Ladies, thank you once again for agreeing to participate in this event, which is not a coincidence that we scheduled for 2 days ahead of Women's International Day. And I also like to look at this webinar as kind of like a build-up to this year's World IP Day, which for those of you who don't know, every year the World Intellectual Property Organization selects a theme, and this year is the interface between IP and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Which are not just about sustainability, right? We also have a goal about good health and well-being, and one about gender equality. And, you know, one thing that really nicely embodies this combination is Femtechs. So to get us started, I think that especially for those who might not have heard about Femtech before, the first question that comes to mind is, why do we talk about Femtech? You know, why do we have to talk about women's health as a separate issue? What makes it necessary and challenge to talk about that? And so to start, I would invite Kathrin to provide, you know, her view on that.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I always love to talk about Femtech at any opportunity I get. So I'm very excited that you decided to also dedicate this webinar and this space to the topic. So thank you for that. On your question, so you talked about it a little bit in my introduction. I first got into the Femtech space after really as a patient when I was diagnosed with polycystic ovary syndrome in my early 30s. Maybe some of you are not so familiar with the condition. It's basically a hormonal imbalance that affects actually 1 in 10 women. And I was in my 30s, I worked for a tech company, and I, was always on some sort of diet and, really was working out and, thought I knew what women's health was. And then I was hit with a diagnosis and a condition that I had never heard of. And I think that just, changed my view of myself and of the world. And I realized how little I actually knew about women's health. And so, that's actually my first answer to your question would be, why do we need to talk more about women's health? Why do we need to talk more about Femtech? It's really because, there are so many of us who actually don't really know a lot about our own bodies, or many of us who, identify as women or as female. And I think that's like really the first reason why we need to have more open conversations. And I think it really always in this space starts with a lack of awareness around these topics. And so it affected me as a patient that, was only diagnosed with a condition after struggling with the symptoms for more than a decade. But it also affects us sort of, on an entrepreneurial level. So, imagine you're the founder or the co-founder of a company, maybe in the, I don't know, endometriosis space. And, you're trying to raise money for your startup or your company, and you're sitting across a VC, and we still know the demographics in the VC industry. Unfortunately, there's a lot of men that make investment decisions. And, it's often the case that as a Femtech founder, I will sit there and, we'll hear, well, this all sounds really nice, but if this was really such a big issue, I would have heard of it, right? And so I think really this lack of awareness for women's health, and then, in consequence also for Femtech, and the need for solutions in this space kind of, really hurts the industry, hurts innovation, hurts funding that innovation gets both in the private sector, but also into research, really. And, we need novel therapies. We have a huge gender research gap in a sense that, we don't have a lot of data on a lot of these different conditions that affect women, either directly, exclusively, differently, or also predominantly. And I think, having more open conversations about a lot of these topics, both in a sort of, public, but also business perspective, is really important in order to move the field forward, and also in order to, make sure women just, really receive better care. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, there is a one point that you touched that I think it's very central, right, for this discussion, which is the lack of awareness and the lack of data, right? Fran, would you like to jump in on that? I know you have interesting data also because you're very passionate about Femtechs as well, right?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's really interesting, isn't it, that point about lack of awareness. I mean, I was similarly lack of aware. I'm a flipping life scientist. I've done degrees in biology and life sciences, and I've kind of got to the perimenopause stage and discovered there was a whole bunch of stuff that I knew nothing about. And it does feed heavily, I think, into that investment point and the startup point about investors being predominantly male, and just there being a complete lack of awareness. Why would people invest in something where they don't understand what the size of the market is? And you can understand why people would reach this conclusion. I mean, certainly my mother's generation, I mean, I didn't know very much about what happened to her and kind of women's health issues that she might have discovered, and certainly not from my grandmother's era. We just didn't talk about it. It's just not part of the conversation. And you have women going through, frankly, astonishing disorders, illnesses, sicknesses, problems, challenges that, we women don't know anything about until we come across them. So we can't expect other women to necessarily know these are problems that need solutions. And we certainly can't expect a predominantly male investment community to understand the size of the problem or why that might need addressing. I mean, some of the statistics about that are particularly damning when you consider that I think women spend 25% more time in ill health than men. And part of that is the conversation that we spent so long just shutting up and getting on with it. That firstly, some of these things just, we just carried on and didn't think they were a problem worth discussing. Then there's a whole bunch of stuff about medical gaslighting and dismissing women's pain and conditions, and it's just in your head, dear, it'll get better. And that all comes from this picture of lack of awareness and lack of talking about it. So I definitely think that a key thing that needs to happen is just more discussion about this, which is why it's absolutely brilliant to be talking with you all today, and for the conversation around Femtech to be on the rise. But I do want to kind of emphasize that this isn't just a women's problem. I mean, when we talk about the size of this problem, it's astonishing. I mean, I know the recent McKinsey report had it as costing the economy, something, the global economy, like $1 trillion by 2040. This is not a small amount of money. This affects all of us. So it's not just you know, the fact that it's a good idea to make sure that women aren't living 25% more in ill health than men are, and it's not about necessarily just increasing lifespan. This impacts all of us. It impacts men and it impacts women because our colleagues, our family members, the people we are friends with, hang out with, who run businesses, they're also women and they're also going through these challenges. And these people are contributing to global economy, they're feeding our pensions, you know, all of this stuff. If we can if we can raise women's health across the board, we can make life better for all of us. Why wouldn't we be doing that?
Luíza, I think you're on mute. Yeah.
That. And I just wanted to piggyback on what you were saying there, Fran. You know, that same report talks about if we could, you know, solve some of these women's health issues, it would boost the economy by $1 trillion by 2040. And it gives a lot of women opportunities to get out of poverty and improve their lives, not only for themselves, but their families and generations to follow. So there really is tremendous economic potential if we can raise this level of awareness. And, you know, we talked about awareness, and I just wanted to add, I'm sure many of us can relate to, you know, you talked about medical gaslighting. I was reading an article that was saying that a lot of physicians aren't even, male physicians aren't even trained in medical school to recognize female problems. So I'm curious, like for Kathrin, you mentioned you went a long time before you got a diagnosis. You know, there's a very common with women and our medical conditions where physicians don't even know what to look for because they're not even familiar with what the symptoms of polycystic disease are. You know, maybe it's lupus, other things. So again, another reason why we need to raise the level of awareness and education.
Yes, and one thing that since you mentioned the McKinsey report, right, that was prepared together with the World Economic Forum, it was published, I think, in January. Another very interesting thing is, I think when people hear about women's health problem and Femtechs, the first thing that comes to mind is sexual and reproductive health, right? And obviously those two are important and are an important part of the discussion. But when we talk about the woman's health burden, is also about diseases that affect women and men, but affect women disproportionately or in a different manner. And the thing is that the clinical trials, they are not often considering how those diseases will impact women, and therefore the treatment will not, you know, properly address that. I don't know if you have anything you would like to, you know, comment on that in terms of what you might have viewed. Kathrin, in your experience, you know, of what you see in terms of examples of Femtechs, are they mostly directed to sexual and maternity health, or do you also see some discussion in terms of those other diseases?
I think, to be honest, the vast majority that we see is the reproductive health. And, you know, I actually like to talk about that quite a bit. So, you know, we're really seeing kind of a lot of startups and that, you know, that are founded, but also startups that manage to receive funding to sort of lie along or, like, you know, support women throughout their reproductive life. So we're really starting with kind of, you know, menstruation, menarche, first periods, period products, period tracking apps, then moving on into that next stage of life where it's like about either trying to not have a baby or trying to have a baby. So contraception, fertility, you know, anything that's assisted reproductive technology. We're seeing a lot of investment specifically in sort of the fertility space and the assisted reproductive technology space. So IVF, big topic at the moment. And then sort of the next big thing that we're seeing getting quite a bit of attention is sort of the end of women's reproductive lives, which is sort of, you know, perimenopause, then menopause and the post-menopause time, and sort of how to manage all these transitions. I always like to make it a point that it's really, really important that we also look at, kind of mental health, behavioral health, in women specifically, much higher anxiety scores, depression scores, caregiver stress are really classic examples where women are predominantly affected. Alzheimer's, another example sort of on the brain health side. The classic example that we like to use sort of on conditions that impact women in different ways would be cardiac disease. So, we know that women get diagnosed much later, or like the symptoms of a heart attack are just simply different in women than in men. So that leads to a lot of late diagnosis. And so, obviously we have other issues also in the reproductive health space around women's pain, endometriosis, with women waiting up to 9 years for a diagnosis. And we're really wasting time. And we heard that stat, women are spending 25% of more of their time in bad health. And it's really because we have all these also diagnostic challenges around a lot of these issues. And women are just very much conditioned often to accept pain or discomfort as just like normal and bottom line. And then, add to that the medical gaslighting and it's going to be okay, I'll just, deal with it somehow. And, frankly, just not knowing that there's better out there. And, that's what also happened to me with, when I was finally diagnosed with polycystic ovary syndrome. I've been dealing with the symptoms for 10 years, right? And I was like, well, I guess this is my life, right? And when I was diagnosed, I always like to tell people it was like a little bit of a like bittersweet moment almost, because it's like on the one hand, it's like, oh no, I have to deal with a chronic condition right now. But yeah, on the other hand, you finally have answers and you can actually, do something about what you're in. But I think generally speaking, also to go back to your question, I kind of, sidetracked a little bit there. We're really seeing most of the funding still in the reproductive health space. And I think this is also kind of due to the fact that we're seeing, we're just understanding this space better from a research perspective. Like we actually have research and solutions that work. And, we're just still very, very, there's a lot of white spaces sort of, beyond sort of this women's reproductive health area. And, we really need research to kind of, pick up there. And, if we don't have the data, if we don't really understand what's happening in women's bodies in connection to a lot of, these conditions, there's limited opportunity to really improve treatment pathways, also come up with, better solutions, be it drugs, be it, medical devices, whatever it may be. So I think in these spaces, we're still really lacking a lot of research and just an understanding of basic female biology and causes, cures, etc.
Yeah, great. So since we have here Luíza, who is from the US, Fran, who is from the UK, Anna from Brazil, I think it would be nice to hear from them, especially because they are all, to their own manner, involved with life science, a little bit how this research data, how is it being addressed? Or is it being addressed?
Well, if I may begin, a point that Kathrin was talking about regarding mental health, I think it's really crucial at this point when we talk about women's health, because in Brazil, for example, a recent research showed that 45% of Brazilian women have been diagnosed with anxiety, depression, or other mental disorders. This is a 2023 data. It's a recent data, and that shows something important for us, because if we take information from international index, we see that the burden of working hours every day is much more harder and heavier for women than for men. So many research show that women work every day like 30 to 40% more than men. So it's important when we talk about women's health and mental health in women to consider this burden and to also consider the reproductive issues that we have that men are not going to have, and the hormonal cycles and everything that only women can feel. So this is important because when we also talk about, as Tatiana was speaking about, general diseases that affect both women and men, the impact for us is different. It's different because we handle every day much more household chores and everything, and we also handle the reproduction role that's all, we will always follow the women figure. So this is really important, and also the lack of specific clinical studies and everything about women's health. Must also consider that, for example, in Brazil, we have a horrible data on breast cancer, for example. Breast cancer is the leading cause of cancer death in women in Brazil, and is the leading cancer that leads to death in Brazil. And we don't have any campaigns, public campaigns or anything to make exams, preventive measures for women. So it's awareness. I think the main word when we talk about women's health is awareness, because we don't have any public policy directed to these matters. So I think we have many points that are important for understanding why there is a lack of awareness.
So maybe I'll jump in and talk a little bit about the US. And not surprisingly, I think like a lot of other countries around the world, historically, men have been the subject of study of medicine and biology, and really questions about sex-based differences were rarely investigated or even recorded. And in fact, when I was preparing for today, I learned that in the US, women of childbearing age weren't even allowed to participate in clinical trials up until 1993, when the NIH passed an act requiring that if you use federal funds to conduct a clinical trial, you had to include women. And there was a very large cardiovascular study. It was related to congestive heart failure that went 1987 to 2012 in the US, where only 25% of the patients were women. And as Kathrin, you mentioned, cardiovascular disease presents very differently in women. So that was, some of what we're seeing here in the US. There are other statistics, like in 2000, women reported their total adverse events from approved medicines were 52% more frequent than men, and 35% of those were serious or fatal. And in 1980, medical products were about 3.5 times more likely to be removed from the market because of safety risks to women versus men. So we have had a lot of struggles here in the US when it comes to, not only research on women and women-related issues, but also clinical trials. But last November, President Biden did sign an initiative to undertake more research in women's health. It was led by First Lady Jill Biden and Carolyn Major. So we're starting to see the tide change. And President Biden instructed all federal agencies to find ways to incentivize research on women's health issues to try and close this gender gap.
Fran, would you like to talk a little bit about the UK?
Yeah, I think, in many ways, the story is echoed in the UK. We similarly have terrible statistics around women's mental health and testing and breast cancer, ovarian cancer. The numbers aren't great. Female mortality is frankly shocking compared to where I would expect it to be in 2024. But I am seeing some green shoots in the country in which I live. For starters, we've had a lot of conversation in the UK around menopause in the last sort of 3 to 4 years. That's really raising the conversation on that. And whilst that doesn't apply to all women, or at least doesn't apply to all women at this point in time, it does raise the conversation about women's health issues, and it has led to a flurry of companies pulling out menopause-friendly workplaces, addressing those policies, and just raising the national dialogue around that. And I think in some cases that could be seen as a kind of gateway condition to actually making some change, which I'm really hopeful for, because you're not seeing, we're equally seeing very poor levels of funding into women's conditions, the same kind of levels of enrollment in clinical trials, or the prohibition of enrolment into clinical trials following the thalidomide scandal. We saw similar restrictions on allowing women until very recently. And they're just not collecting the data. I think that's the other thing. Trials are meant to report on things, but I think about 5% of clinical trials report on the gender or gender-based effects. So that does need to be changed. I think we could really do with a law that says, well, you have to consider your women, but you have to tell us, irrespective of whether the condition is thought to impact them differently, you have to actually go and look. And that goes to all things, whether it's a reproductive health thing or whether it's a dementia treatment, because dementia is more prevalent in women. As you say, cardiac problems presenting very differently. We need to be looking at the data. And so one thing that I am hopeful about is the kind of change we're seeing in kind of AI use and just big data analysis of these trials, looking at all the biomarkers, upping the precision in the analysis. I think we need to be bringing gender into that analysis too and making conclusions based on that. Because that'll help. I mean, it'll help women's health, but it'll also help men's health. Those statistics that Lisa just mentioned about adverse effects. Well, there are drugs being taken off the market because they have too many adverse effects. Are those drugs actually having too many adverse effects, or are they having too many adverse effects in women? In which case, perhaps they could still be on the toolkit list for men, but just not prescribed for women. So increasing the in-depth analysis, I think, is something that we could really do. And in terms of kind of the funding environment in the UK, I mean, funding for anything right now is a bit of a challenge for our government. But we are seeing some initiatives. There is, I think, off the back of the kind of menopause work, we're seeing the government via its funding arms investing in Femtech startups and providing things like incubators and programs to accelerate the startup of Femtechs. And so that's great, but it's the start. Let's get going, please.
I think one important takeaway, right, from all the, Anna and Luíza and Fran's, what they said, it's about how we have a lack of government policies, right, and how actions by governments can help, because in terms of if you require that you have sex disaggregated data in clinical trials, companies are going to have to comply that, and then we're going to start to have data. So yeah, I think one thing that it's important also to bring these conversations to the public, so sometimes even people in government aren't aware of this, to the extent that they need to take action. And also connected, I think, to a lack of awareness, and this comes to mind when Fran says that there is a lot of talk nowadays about menopause in the UK. It's interesting. I mean, how this lack of awareness is connected to cultural taboos, right? And this can also shift by political issues that we see sometimes, right? And I think connected to that, one thing that I would, provoke so we can discuss here is that how can we change the mindset surrounding women's health in order to, make this industry surpass the barrier of just, women talking about it, women's leading those business. Is that something, that you have reflected upon? I think, Kathrin, it would be nice to hear from you how you see these conversations going on among the Femtechs, among startups. How do they deal with this?
I mean, I really built a company based on sort of, having that conversation, because I think it's so important. And it is like kind of, again, we need to, like, Femtech to a certain extent, or women's health is unrightfully still seen as a niche by many, right? And like, it's just, it's kind of, I mean, to me personally, just making a difference in women's life is enough of a reason to make a difference, sort of in women's health, and work on all these innovations and research and whatever else it may take. But the world we live in, and we need money, and sometimes I like to say no money, no mission, right? And so it's important that we also fund this research, fund these innovations, and in order to convince those that are, in the position to actually fund this, we also need to kind of, show the returns. That this could be on a health economic level. Like, we've heard the 1 trillion by economic impact by 2040 number that recently came out from McKinsey. But, we're also seeing this like on a health economic level. Just like, how can we, just reduce wait lists in the UK in the NHS? How can we just, make healthcare systems more efficient? How can we help providers to be more efficient in terms of how they care for their patients through, I don't know, AI assisted prescription, or, sort of better in between appointment care, whatever it may mean. So I think, besides just speaking, well, and I'm obviously I'm a mission driven founder, I wouldn't be in this field probably, or I would have probably left this field already by now. But I think, besides having the conversation about we need to do this in order to really ensure that all women in the world have access to the care they need and deserve, I think, there's a very, very sound financial argument that can be made for investments in this space, because it's just so underserved and underfunded, and there's like really this whole movement building of like more conversation, women simply asking for better and no longer being satisfied with the status quo. So I think from that perspective, it's super important to have this conversation also on a very sort of almost emotionless objective level, where we're like, well, this is simply good business. And I genuinely believe that we're in the women's health space, in it's one of the few spaces where you can generally do good and get good returns, and it's really a win-win situation for everybody. So I really encourage everybody who's in the in the position to invest to kind of look at this space. And yeah, I think it just makes financial sense to invest in women's health beyond like sort of the societal impact it can have.
So Kathrin, I agree with you on that point. I mean, in the US, we're facing a lot of challenges when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion in view of the Supreme Court's decision last year. So it used to be you could argue DEI was the right thing to do, Femtech was the right thing to do, improve women's health. But what we're seeing is you really have to, to change that mindset now in the US and comply with what the law is, really say it, make that business case for it, to your point about the economic sense, and I like to point out we're 51% of the population. We make like 80% of household healthcare decisions. We have tremendous purchasing power. And if you look at it historically over time, economic growth over the past 70 years has been tied to increasing women in the labor force. So if we can solve some of these women's health issues, that, get rid of this healthcare gap and get women into the workforce, that's just going to be a benefit for everyone economically. So in the US, that's kind of the tack that, we're having to take to try and change mindsets.
Yeah, I think relating to that point, you kind of got two tacks, haven't you? I suspect that persuading the investment community about the point about increasing women's participation in the workforce is a good thing. I suspect it's going to be a real challenge to get them to kind of invest on the back of that. But governments should be stepping up to do that. Having all of your having 50% of your population in the workforce, or getting close to it if they want to, it should be a thing that they can support. And so initiatives in healthcare and providing things on that scale should be able to do that. So the investment community, it is going to be all about returns. And it's worth saying that we do have returns in Femtech. I mean, we've had significant exits. I was listening to something the other day which pointed out that we've got well over 100 companies that have listed because off the back of Femtech, and still it's considered this niche idea. As Lisa said, we're 51% of the population. We are not niche. Healthcare for us is not niche. But I think it's about that nervousness about, I've not really heard about it before. It's not really a thing, is it? And so that's where this kind of shouting it from the rooftops, raising it. And I think we're just going to have, there's this statistic that gets banded around about women applying for jobs when they're 60% qualified, whereas men applying at 30%. I think the same might be true for Femtechs, that Femtechs have to be that much bigger, the exits have to be that much more cash in the hands of their investors before the investment community will sit up and notice. So I think keep doing more of the same. And probably what I suspect we need to start with big returns in the kind of reproductive health of the aspects that Kathrin was talking about pregnancy and maternity care and hormones and all the rest of it. And only once we've managed to kind of prove the concept through the passionate people in those areas will we actually see the success in other areas, like the cardiac diseases, the cancer therapies that respond differently in women, the dementia care, and that kind of, I kind of see that as, unfortunately, women's health round 2, which is the stuff that's really valuable, possibly even more valuable for ensuring long-term health. But I think it has to come on the back of great gains in the reproductive space because of the passionate people leading the way.
On that note about potential of this industry, I think it's nice to create a link with IP, right? Because that's something we are all somewhat familiar with. And in terms of, so I think one nice question to put it here so we can discuss is, what are the challenges and the possibilities in terms of IP protection? Because the first thing that comes to mind is, because you don't have a lot of research, you don't have a lot of, you still have a vast unexplored space, you may have more opportunity in terms of patenting inventions, right? Because you're not going to have as much prior art. So how do you see, first, let's start with the possibilities. What do you see in terms of possibilities for IP protection that you might have dealt with, for instance, for a startup or for a multinational company that is in this field?
Well, I think the possibilities are vast. It's just getting, there tend to not to be a lot of women inventors, and that's something we're struggling with. And the stats show that women inventors tend to create solutions for these types of female problems that we've been talking about. Whether it's menopause or reproductive health. So I think there is a lot of opportunity, and there definitely is a lot of white space because there haven't been a lot of inventions in this area. So I think getting women to invent in this space, the possibilities really are pretty vast.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, half the battle with obtaining a decent patent portfolio is about not having very close prior art that you have to navigate around. And if that prior art doesn't exist, then you're in much better shape of a broader claim. I think there are some definite challenges in this space, though. Firstly, based on the tech, and this hesitation around, is it really all that exciting? That kind of subjective decision that goes into the assessment of inventive step and obviousness, which must be passed in order to get the patent granted. Still, we see certainly the European Patent Office. I mean, actually, the primary examiners at the European Patent Office are about gender neutral, I think now, about 50-50. But in the boards of appeal, the higher courts of the European Patent Office, they're very heavily male dominated. So if you're getting an invention up to them because they think it's of questionable inventive step, that the contribution isn't high enough, that's going to probably be a harder battle, I think. I mean, not because of an overt discrimination, but because of this hunch that maybe it's not really all that important. So I think that's something that has to be factored in. Maybe not, I mean, certainly don't put yourself off from filing a patent application in the first place. But it definitely means that I think your invention story has to be a little bit stronger, or may want to be a little bit stronger, particularly in some areas where we haven't been shouting about them. And that again comes down, if you've got lots of data, put that in, because that's really helpful for us.
Yeah, you raise an interesting question. Are femtech inventions harder to get granted? And if so, I think this question can be divided in three, right? One, are they harder? Two, perhaps are there some inventions that are harder than others? For instance, IVF, inventions that are related to sexual health. And third is, if they are harder to get granted, is that because of bias? Is that because lack of awareness to, you know, how IP protection should be prosecuted, a lack of access, for instance, to good patent attorneys, or even to patent attorneys in general? Luíza, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. There was an article that was published in 2018 in Nature that looked at 2.7 million patent applications in the US. So it looked at a really large number. And it found that women didn't favor, they didn't have a necessarily have as good a result as men did at the patent office. So it was a less favorable result. They found things like they tended to appeal less, which might be a cost issue, or maybe, had something to do with their attorneys. When they did get claims granted in the patent office, they tended to have more words in them. So they were more limiting. So they had less value. They also found that patents that were granted in Femtech to women inventors tended to be cited a lot less than the equivalent patents that were done by purely male-only teams. And interestingly, they found these effects were higher in the life sciences area than in other areas and other technologies. So, the data, and yes, it is a couple of years old, does show that women struggle more at the USPTO than men do. And so the question for that is, like you said, is it the drafting of the application? Is it the counsel they chose? Or is there some type of gender bias at the patent office? I think that is where we definitely need some more data. And I'd be curious, Fran, if you've seen similar things in the UK.
Yeah, I've not seen a similar study from the UK, but I do remember an Australian study last year which showed very similar things, that the chances of getting grant if your patent listed an all-female inventor team was significantly lower than if it was an all-male inventor team. Now, there's subtleties to that. We don't really know what's going on. I mean, not least because we don't collect the data. So I think a first step in the patent system would be definitely to actually collect that information and try and drill down into it. The studies that I've seen have done this kind of based on an analysis of the names, so going through and kind of trying to predict whether they are a woman's name or a man's name, which of course can be particularly challenging. Particularly with a lot of Asian inventors who you can't necessarily tell which gender their name falls into. So I do think that it would be useful for us to be collecting that information, even if it doesn't necessarily go through to the primary examiners for them to look at. Keeping them in the dark would be great. But I think it would yield some information. Something that is kind of that feeds into this as well, which I think feeds into your point about, did they maybe choose the right counsel to prepare the application? Actually, only 1 in 7 inventors listed on European patent applications is a woman. I mean, that's an astonishing number.
Fundamental problem right there in and of itself.
Yeah. So you've got, and the same happens, of course, in research, that we have a research gap with women being listed on publications and manuscripts going out to press. So women are underrepresented on there, and that in itself, there's a lot of reasons for that. Is it because they didn't bring their inventions forward? Is it because when they, for example, presented it to the person in charge of the patent filing, they dismissed it as a woman's invention, or just looked at it a little bit more harshly than perhaps a colleague from an invention from a male colleague would have been? But I think, I always come back to, I think there's a hesitation around women. This kind of statistic I flipped out earlier, which I don't think is actually based on fact, but the idea that women kind of look at their technology and go, well, I just did the next logical thing, didn't I? As opposed to going, I made a groundbreaking advance there. That's definitely patent worthy, and I shall bring it forward. So something that I'm working to do, and I definitely encourage everyone here to do, is to really think about bringing women's inventions into the patent space, like empowering women around IP, helping them to understand and not self-certify, it's probably just not that much of a big deal. Like, bring it forward. Let me be the judge of that, please. Let's get it before the patent office and let them decide whether it's actually a contribution. Don't just rule yourself out the race before you start. And certainly, you know, one factor that reasons that there was a brilliant study I was alerted to last week of psychology inventors. So psychology professors tend to be female, 2/3 of them, 2/3 of tenured psychology professors are female. And yet, when it comes to citing them, they're something like 30% less likely to be cited than their male colleagues. And I think that all kind of, you know, they did a whole lot of really interesting studies where they asked the men in the department, the tenured men, to list out their colleagues and their contribution, and they asked the women the same. And the women's list had a whole mixture of men and women, and in no particular order, whereas the men tended to think of their men colleagues first and listed the female colleagues and their contribution at the bottom of the list. It wasn't necessarily that they were actively trying to prioritize in that way, but they sometimes had forgotten that they had quite so many women colleagues. And I think that feeds into this 1 in 7 inventors point as well. Have actually all the members of the team been acknowledged as inventors? Was their contribution actually recognised and brought forward onto the patent application? So that's something that certainly as IP attorneys that we can contribute to. Instead of asking who are the inventors, actually ask who else is on the team? You know, could they have invented it too? What about this person? What was their contribution? And actually, you know, kind of draw that out and make sure that we're getting more accurate information up front.
And Fran, to your point, there was just recently an article published by Colleen Chen, who's out at UC, I believe it's at Santa Barbara, where she looked at attribution on papers and compared to the patents that, you know, corresponded to those papers, those publications out of a university context. And she found, you know, while there might have been some attribution for women on publications, somehow they were lost. Their whatever contribution they made never, you know, made it to a patent application. And whether that was a correct determination or not was part of the question she was raising. And that, you know, this lack of attribution between a paper and a patent is a fundamental problem. And in the US, maybe we needed to change the way we looked at inventorship in order to increase the number of women inventors, to try and, you know, get rid of and eliminate this disparity that we're seeing between male and female inventors.
Yeah, and this is important. Obviously, this goes beyond even the issues of Femtechs, right? Because we are talking about women's inventors in general. And if we consider that, I mean, Femtechs, most of the discussion is held within the life science space, right? And in life sciences, where we have more something closer to equality in terms of women scientists and inventors. When we look, for instance, to other like mechanical engineer and telecom engineer, then it's it's very even more disheartening. But in terms, but this conversation has a huge impact for Femtechs, right? Because if women are not, you know, women inventors are not filing applications, if you're not having IP protection sought for inventions developed by Femtechs, this can also impact the business side, right? Because this is something that venture capitals might take into consideration in terms of funding. So Kathrin, perhaps you can provide some insight about how the companies you have dealt with, especially startups, how they look into IP protection, and, you know, if what Luíza and Fran talked about is something that you have seen in from the business side as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's like, you know, kind of on the VC side, obviously the question is always, how is this defensible? You know, is there any IP? What's, you know, kind of what are you actually doing, right? To a certain extent. So obviously, you know, really kind of thinking about these topics very early on is incredibly important. But on the other hand, and I will 100% echo what has been said, it's kind of like, you know, women very often are like, well, you know, but it's not that special. And, you know, so sort of really kind of making that step and even answering the question, you know, raising awareness of like, well, this is actually novel in itself. And like going back to the point that Fran made, you know, let someone else be the judge, whether this is, you know, IP or not. And I think this is just, you know, where we really need to raise awareness. We have in the Femtech space a lot of very mission-driven founders that are really coming into this as patients that are, you know, solving their own problems in one way or another, and may not have, you know, the business background that's, you know, often the, or, you know, this very, I really hate to say this, like, you know, there's like this standard founder that everybody looks like. In the US, it's coming from a business school. In Europe, it's very much, you know, having a consulting or investment banking background. That's like still, you know, what we see, unfortunately, like to see. And I mean, you know, we're talking a lot about diversity and, you know, inclusion and opening up, you know, who founds a company, who creates innovation, right? Like, and by excluding a group of people, really also excluding the solutions we create and address. But I think the bottom line, the point I'm actually trying to make in the IP context is we have a lot of, you know, sort of founders from non-traditional backgrounds. And again, I really don't like this word, but that, you know, may not know about a lot of these intricacies of, you know, I actually need to protect what I'm creating. I need to, you know, I mean, it even starts with trademarks. It starts with, you know, then actual solutions and, you know, kind of, you know, protecting the IP. And it's just like something that, you know, that you may have never encountered in your previous life, in your previous job. And I think it's just like really creating that awareness that, you know, this protecting things early on, thinking about these things actually really gives you a competitive advantage, you know, whether you want to raise or not, I think is very, very important. And I think the awareness among especially early stage founders in the femtech space who may not have the sort of business training in that sense is incredibly important.
I think that's absolutely true. I'd agree with that. Something that also plays into that is often, if you're in a startup and you are looking to raise, it can feel like the VCs are looking for any excuse not to invest in your company, and any kind of wrinkle, weakness, problem with your IP can give rise to that excuse. So I think in Femtechs, looking to persuade possibly slightly more hesitant VCs in the first place, I think your IP just needs to be that little bit better, a little bit cleaner. And so if you're coming into it naive and you're filing your patent application late, or you're thinking about protecting it late, that's a kind of extra problem for you than it would be for other founders. So empowering and helping women to understand IP issues even before they've started a femtech would be a great place to start with that, just raising awareness generally. But secondly, encouraging women to kind of embrace it, find the right advisors early on, get that information so that they can be filing, so that we don't have to play catch up. You know, I see all sorts of, oh goodness me, this has been published, or this is leaked out, or this, that, or the other. Is there something we can do? What scheme can we put in to address this? And we can, you know, we can come up with all sorts of schemes and clever wheezes to try and get you through, but they are all flawed in some way or another. So don't make it more complicated for your VCs to invest in you. Think about IP from the earliest stage. Think about those patent filings earlier, and get them in there so that, you know, we can make sure that when it comes to the investment period, we are presenting a nice, clean portfolio that doesn't require any further explanation, that it speaks for itself without you having to go, oh yeah, that one, there's a reason for this being a bit weird. Like, don't do that. Get it right.
That's a great tip for Femtechs out there. And it's interesting, right? Because I mean, a lot of it might be, we talked a lot about the lack of awareness in terms of women's health, right? But we also have a lack of awareness in terms of how IP works and how important IP might be. And that could also help Femtechs rise as a business. So I think one question that I would like to pose to you all, it's actually a two-part questions, I think, for our last round as we approach 1 hour here in our webinar. I would like to hear from each of you. First of all, what you think is next for this industry, right? Because we talk a lot about, you know, the issues, things that like to be that have to be solved. So what do you think it's important to the industry as a whole, all the stakeholders from the business side, from the IP side, to how they can contribute, how, you know, what is the future of this industry in your view? And second of all, I think it will be nice if you could provide one example of a femtech innovation that got you excited in recently. It can be, and it doesn't have to be a business, you know, it can be, for instance, a women's health innovation that was developed by a multinational, because we also have big pharma focusing on that. So people can learn a bit more about the different companies that are around there. So who'd like to start?
Yeah, I am happy to go first.
Go ahead.
So I think like the future is bright, but not without its challenges. I think that's kind of, how I'm looking at the space. There's a lot of momentum at the moment in the space. I like to tell people I got back into the office this year on January 11th, and it felt like I came back to a new industry. So I think there's a lot of excitement in the space. There's really some things happening. That's sort of my subjective perception of somebody that's been thinking about this space on a daily basis for the pretty much 5 years, actually. And so that's very promising. What I will say, like, it always goes back to the same three things: more awareness, more research, more investment, I think, and it really starts with the awareness. And so again, I'm very grateful for, like, kind of people from all kind of areas in the business world and also in the public spaces having these conversations about these topics. And in terms of an area I'm excited about, I'm having a very, very close eye on anything ovarian health or like ovarian biology at the moment. So the ovary is kind of like the control center for a lot of the hormones in our body. And so there's a few companies trying or working on really understanding, ovarian biology, defining various targets. So if we manage to sort of solve for this, there's potential to actually extend women's reproductive lives, push back or delay menopause and also menopause symptoms. But there's also like kind of, a lot of sort of targets that are in connection with endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome. So I think we have a lot to learn about the ovary. And if we manage to sort of really understand this on a better level and actually, develop drugs that kind of, address a few of these, and obviously, it's going to take a while, very, very early stage research and a very active field of research, fortunately. But in terms of the impact that really understanding our ovaries better can have, I'm very excited about all the companies working in that space, largely on the biotech side.
Who's next? Luíza.
Yeah, I can talk next. So much like Kathrin, I think the future is bright here in the US, and you might be wondering, given all the issues with DI that we have here in the US, why would I feel that way? And the reason for that is, quite honestly, Kathy Vidal at the USPTO and what she's doing. She's put together something called the WE Initiative, which is women entrepreneurship, where she's bringing in women inventors, women in Femtech. She's tying them and connecting them with entrepreneurs. She's tying them with venture funding. She's doing everything she possibly can to try and get more women into tech and get these startups going and becoming more successful. So that has been a really powerful program at the Patent Office. She's tied that in with the Patent Pro Bono program, which can provide free patent services to not only women inventors, but any small startup inventors as well. And there's also some other initiatives like the First Time Filer program, which will result in expedited review at the USPTO. So I think there's a lot of good things going on, thankfully, through our USPTO and Kathy Vidal that are incentivizing women and this field to try and grow and develop at as fast a rate as possible. So I'm excited. And in terms of a company that I'm excited about, it's a company called BioMilk. It's actually a company in North Carolina that has developed lab-grown breast milk. Some of you might be familiar. There was a breast milk formula shortage here last year, and maybe even for the last 2 years with some issues. And so this company has found an alternative, healthy way to supply breast milk and breast milk formula. So we will avoid those shortages that we've had for the last couple of years.
Great. That's very interesting. And it's a nice too, because, we talk a lot about, when we talk about women's health, we are also talking about, maternal health and how this affects
Exactly.
babies as well. Fran, what about you?
Yeah, I'm also feeling quite positive at the moment, which is nice. I think we've had a bit of a tough couple of years in the biotech space, but we're starting to see a change in terms of some investment happening, the green shoots of recovery of that industry, and I think that Femtech is really well placed to solve those challenges, to be kind of the road to recovery. So I'm looking forward to a big kind of change in the way we're viewing Femtech. And I'm also, as I say, really excited to see some of these issues being raised and becoming part of the dialogue. So I really think we might be getting to critical mass now, and to really seeing this industry take off and to really make a difference to women's lives. It's just a bunch of really great initiatives going on, a lot of really passionate people stepping up, and that's really exciting to see. In terms of companies, I'm going to raise a couple. The inspiring Carly Buckling and her company Yoni Health, and also a company called Kathrin. I think that's how you pronounce it, never quite sure. But they are both companies looking at the power of menstrual blood. So that's for diagnostic tools. So menstrual blood is a phenomenal powerhouse of a substance. We've literally binned it, thrown it down the toilet for years and years. It's full of stem cells. It's full of information about how women's health is. It's a freely available source of blood that doesn't involve a kind of invasive test on women. And so instead of throwing it down the toilet and getting rid of it, these companies are looking at harnessing it, collecting it, using it for personalized and precision diagnostics, using it to develop new therapies, new biomarkers, new treatments. I think that's really exciting. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how those develop over the next couple of years.
Great. Anna, so what do you think is exciting about the future of Femtech in Brazil? What is challenging too?
Yeah, I think we have to start at some point to understand how we can develop this discussion here in our country, because especially hearing from Fran, Kathrin, and Luíza, I feel that we are a few steps behind this discussion. So I think me, you, and all the women that are taking part of this movement to start talking about Femtechs and to equality and gender-related topics, we have to take to the government, take to the public authorities, and try to find solutions to introduce this discussion in Brazil. I think we have to involve the government in the discussion, because we have a public health system that, as I said before, is response from the most part, the majority of our health system. So we have to consider the role of the state in this discussion, but also we have to be conscious about what is being a successful benchmark and in the comparative perspective to bring these ideas to our country, considering our particularities. So we are in a big, we are starting a big movement now to try to begin this discussion here. So I think we have to take a look at our regulatory marks and regulatory rules and everything that we have, and try to think about solutions that that give us mechanisms to start the discussion here. And I think the funding problem that was mentioned by many of the talks that we had today, this might be tackled if this movement going to the government, talking to the government, this might help as the initiative that Biden is making in the US. I think this seems to be viable in a certain way here, because we have a big budget for health issues in Brazil. So I know that we have many things to handle now. I don't know if Luíza, Fran, and Kathrin are aware, but we are facing a big epidemic on dengue, that is a tropical disease here in Brazil. So of course we have many other priorities, but this can't be ignored as it's being now. So we have to start writing and talking and trying to engage stakeholders, important stakeholders to this matter, because Femtechs are the future. I think we have to talk about it. We are more of the half of the population, not only Brazil, but in many other countries. So we have to stand for our rights and support ourselves in better solutions. So I think it's that.
Wonderful. I'll just add citing one Brazilian Femtech that I'm very excited about. It's called Azil Biosciences. They have been dedicated to developing products for oncology and women's health. One of them is called Self-Cervix, and it's basically a device for self-collection of cells from the cervix for diagnosis of HPV and other sexually transmitted infections and liquid cytology exams. So I think that's one example of how in Brazil too we can come up with creative solutions that contribute to because usually the conversation is very much advanced in the global north, but if the global south also dedicate time and resources, especially to those areas, we really need basically all hands on deck, right? So with that, I would like to thank you all for this discussion today. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for our audience. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on YouTube and Spotify later on if anyone would like to rewatch, and we'll definitely, the people who couldn't watch it live will also have access to this discussion. So thank you, Luíza, Fran, Kathrin, Anna. It was a pleasure having you today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.